The Gavel of Justice and the Silent Language of Dreams. Judge William Hawthorne had spent the last 30 years on the bench in Millbrook, a town where tradition reigned supreme. At 62, his salt and pepper hair and stern gaze commanded authority. To him, justice was a clear, uncompromising path shaped by decades of precedent and a family legacy deeply intertwined with the law. His father had been a judge, and his grandfather a distinguished lawyer. The courtroom was sacred ground, and for Judge Hawthorne, it was where order was restored, decisions were final, and disruptions were swiftly quelled. But as the years had passed, so had the world around him, evolving in ways he struggled to comprehend. The calls for criminal justice reform, diversity, and compassion felt to him like a direct assault on the system he had spent his life preserving. His mind had grown rigid, his judgments increasingly influenced by long-held assumptions. Despite his position as an arbiter of justice, he had grown blind to the nuances of human experiences outside his narrow worldview. Meanwhile, on the other side of Millbrook, lived Zoe Johnson. At just 14 years old, Zoe carried the kind of joy that could light up any room. She was the youngest of 3 children, raised by hard-working parents who had taught her the value of persistence, kindness, and resilience. Her mother, Tanya, was a nurse who worked double shifts at the local hospital, while her father, Marcus, spent long hours repairing cars in his small mechanic shop. Life wasn't easy, but the Johnson family knew how to turn challenges into stepping stones. What set Zoe apart, though, was not just her infectious smile or her quick wit, it was her determination to defy the limitations imposed by others. Zoe had been born hard of hearing, and from an early age, she had learned to navigate the world through sign language. Her hands were her voice, and she wielded them with grace, turning silence into eloquence. Though she excelled at school, particularly in subjects like math and science, there were days when Zoe felt the sting of being different. Some kids didn't understand her, some were unkind, and others simply didn't take the time to listen. But Zoe had dreams bigger than any of those barriers. She wanted to be an engineer, like the ones who designed the machines her father worked on. She imagined herself building bridges, not just physical ones, but those that connected people across divides of misunderstanding. On a warm Saturday afternoon, Zoe set off for the courthouse, a historic building that was part of a school project on local government. She loved sketching in her free time, and she thought a drawing of the courthouse would be the perfect contribution to her class presentation. Armed with her sketchpad, she found a quiet bench outside the courthouse, her face beaming as she tapped on her phone. Her best friend Alex appeared on the screen, signing animatedly as they chatted through video call. Their conversation was lively, filled with laughter and plans for the future. What Zoe didn't know was that her world was about to collide with Judge Hawthorne's in a way that neither of them could have predicted. From his second-story office window, Judge Hawthorne glanced down at the young girl on the bench, her hands moving rapidly in what seemed to him like erratic, deliberate gestures. His instincts, honed over years of judging cases, instantly placed her actions into a box of suspicion. A group of teenagers had been arrested the previous month for using hand signals to communicate during a drug deal just blocks away. To him, it looked like Zoe might be doing something similar. The judge's hand tightened around his phone, his thoughts racing. He saw the world through a lens of order versus disorder, and at that moment, Zoe was disorder. Without a second thought, he dialed the Millbrook Police Department. Millbrook Police Department, how can I assist you? The dispatcher's voice was steady, professional. This is Judge William Hawthorne. I'm calling from the courthouse. There's a young individual outside, making what appear to be gang signs or some sort of coded gestures. I believe this warrants immediate investigation, he said, his tone as unyielding as a gavel striking wood. As the judge provided a description of Zoe, the dispatcher assured him that an officer would be dispatched promptly. For Judge Hawthorne, it was a small action in a routine day, a call to maintain order, to prevent potential chaos from spreading into his pristine town. But for Zoe, who continued to chat with her friend under the afternoon sun, oblivious to the storm brewing above. It was the beginning of an ordeal that would challenge not only her, but the entire town's perceptions of justice, compassion, and humanity. The officer assigned to the call was Officer James Mitchell, a young man who had grown up in Millbrook but had spent a few years working in the city before returning to his hometown. Officer Mitchell was known for his calm demeanor, and unlike some of his colleagues, he didn't rush to judgment. When he received the call from dispatch, his first thought was not suspicion, but confusion. Gang signs outside the courthouse, in broad daylight, in this quiet town. Still, he had a job to do. As he drove toward the courthouse, Mitchell reminded himself that things weren't always as they seemed. His time in the city had taught him that sometimes the real story lay beneath the surface of first impressions. Meanwhile, inside the courthouse, Judge Hawthorne sat back in his chair, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction. He had taken action, as he always did, to protect the town. Order would be restored. But little did he know, the scene that would unfold in the next hour wouldn't just change Zoe's life. It would begin to crack the rigid walls of his own beliefs, forcing him to confront his deeply ingrained biases in a way that even he couldn't anticipate. Outside, Zoe continued to laugh and sign with Alex, unaware that the wheels of justice, both flawed and powerful, were turning in her direction. What had begun as a peaceful afternoon sketching the historic building was about to become the start of a story that would echo far beyond the courthouse walls, challenging not only the people of Millbrook, but also the foundations of how they viewed each other. For Zoe, the courthouse was about to become the stage where her strength and character would shine brighter than ever before. For Judge Hawthorne, it would become the place where his own beliefs would be put on trial. The arrival of Officer Mitchell and the seeds of change. The afternoon air was still warm as Officer James Mitchell pulled into the courthouse parking lot, the rhythmic hum of the engine coming to a stop. His brow furrowed as he scanned the quiet surroundings. The courthouse stood tall and silent, its aging brick walls reflecting decades of history in the small town of Millbrook. On the bench near the front steps sat the girl Judge Hawthorne had called about. Zoe was engrossed in her conversation with Alex on her phone, her hands moving gracefully in the air, oblivious to the police cruiser that had just arrived. Officer Mitchell's training had taught him to assess situations quickly, but nothing about Zoe's actions seemed out of the ordinary. Gang signs, he muttered to himself, shaking his head in disbelief. He'd seen gang activity during his time in the city, and this didn't fit the picture. The judge must have misinterpreted something. But there was no turning back now. He had a duty to investigate. Stepping out of his car, Mitchell adjusted his police cap, took a deep breath, and approached the bench where Zoe sat. As he neared, Zoe glanced up, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of the uniformed officer, but her expression remained calm. Officer Mitchell could sense her alertness, the way her hands briefly stilled, as if assessing whether she was in trouble. "Excuse me, miss," Mitchell said in a low, non-threatening tone. "May I speak with you for a moment?" Zoe's gaze shifted quickly to her phone screen, where Alex was still signing. Confused by the interruption, Zoe signed back, indicating that she needed to pause their conversation. She looked up at the officer, tilting her head slightly in question, then lifted her hands and sighed. "I can't hear you. Can you write it down?" Mitchell blinked, caught off guard. He had never encountered someone who was hard of hearing during his time in Millbrook. But after a beat, he nodded and quickly pulled out a notepad and pen from his breast pocket. Zoe watched him carefully, her face neutral but curious. He scribbled a few words onto the notepad. "I'm Officer Mitchell. Someone reported suspicious activity. Can we talk?" When Zoe read the note, she frowned, her expressive eyes narrowing in confusion. Suspicious activity. All she had been doing was talking to Alex and sketching the courthouse. She took the notepad from him and signed her response before realizing he wouldn't understand. With a bit of hesitation, she wrote back, "I'm just talking to my friend and drawing. What's suspicious?" Officer Mitchell glanced at the note, already feeling a rising discomfort in his chest. This didn't feel right, but he had to follow protocol. So he wrote back. A judge called. Said you were making strange gestures. Thought it might be gang signs. When Zoe read that, her face flushed with a mixture of disbelief and hurt. She shook her head, her hand clenched around the pen as if she wanted to hurl it away. Instead, she took a deep breath and wrote, I'm deaf. These are not gang signs. This is sign language. I'm talking to my friend on my phone. Mitchell's heart sank as he read the words. He felt a wave of embarrassment wash over him. It was the kind of mistake he thought he would never make. But here he was, standing in front of a young girl whose only crime was her way of communicating. He could see it in her eyes now, the frustration, the disbelief, and he knew he had to make this right. Hang on, he gestured with his hands, awkwardly signaling for her to wait. He turned, pacing back to his squad car, pulling out his phone to call Judge Hawthorne. Back inside the courthouse, Judge Hawthorne had resumed his paperwork, a sense of accomplishment settling over him. His eyes flicked to the clock. It had only been about 15 minutes since his call. He expected Officer Mitchell to report back soon with confirmation of his suspicions. The ringing of his phone interrupted his thoughts. Judge Hawthorne speaking, he answered. Judge, it's Officer Mitchell. I'm at the courthouse, and, there's been a misunderstanding. A wave of irritation crossed the judge's face. What do you mean, misunderstanding? Is she not the individual I described? She is, sir, Mitchell replied, but the girl isn't making gang signs. She's hard of hearing. She's using sign language. She was just talking to her friend over video call. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. Judge Hawthorne's mind struggled to reconcile what he had just heard. The girl was deaf, using sign language. That can't be right, the judge said slowly, his tone edged with skepticism. Are you sure she wasn't being deceptive? Mitchell's grip on the phone tightened. He'd respected Judge Hawthorne growing up. He was the kind of figure you looked up to in a small town like Millbrook. But this? He could hear the undercurrent of denial in the judge's voice, a refusal to let go of his assumptions. Unsure, sir, Mitchell replied firmly. This is just a young girl who came here to sketch the courthouse for a school project. She's not a threat. I suggest we let her be. Judge Hawthorne's jaw clenched. He wasn't used to being challenged, least of all by an officer who was supposed to uphold the law. But something in Mitchell's voice gave him pause. He turned back to the window and looked down at Zoe again, this time really seeing her. She wasn't some hardened criminal or a gang member plotting illegal activities. She was a teenager, just a kid, sitting on a bench with a sketchpad. For the first time in a long while, doubt crept into the judge's mind. Had he jumped to conclusions? Was his rigid view of the world blinding him to the reality of the situation? I'll take your word for it, officer, Hawthorne finally said, though his voice lacked its usual authority. But I'll want to speak with you about this later. Understood, sir, Mitchell said before hanging up. Returning to Zoe, Mitchell saw the uncertainty in her eyes. She hadn't been able to follow his phone call, but the weight of the conversation was evident in his posture. He handed her the notepad again, writing a quick message. It's all cleared up. You're not in trouble. Sorry for the misunderstanding. Zoe read the note and looked up at him, her expression softening slightly. She gave him a small, reluctant nod before signing. Thank you. Officer Mitchell smiled awkwardly, not fully understanding the signs but sensing her gratitude. With a final nod, he stepped away, leaving Zoe to her sketches and her conversation with Alex. But as he walked back to his cruiser, his mind lingered on the exchange. Something wasn't sitting right with him, and he had a feeling this wasn't the last he'd hear of the incident. Inside the courthouse, Judge Hawthorne sat back in his chair, staring at the paperwork in front of him, but not seeing it. His mind was elsewhere, on the girl outside, on the phone call, on the possibility that he had been wrong. It wasn't something he was accustomed to, being wrong. But if he was wrong about this, what else had he misjudged in the past? As the evening shadows lengthened and the courthouse emptied, The seeds of change had already been planted in the judge's mind. The rigid walls of his world, built on decades of certainty and tradition, had begun to crack. And from that crack, the light of a new understanding, one he wasn't ready to admit yet, was starting to shine through. To be continued. In this part, we witnessed the first confrontation between Zoe and the justice system she's unknowingly been caught up in. The exchange with Officer Mitchell sows the seeds of doubt in Judge Hawthorne's mind, setting the stage for the deeper reflections and transformative events to come. The ripple effect of assumptions. The next morning, the town of Millbrook woke up to the usual hum of life, a quiet, predictable rhythm. But for Zoe Johnson, the events of the previous day still loomed large in her mind. The casual afternoon she'd spent sketching at the courthouse had turned into something entirely different, a lesson in how quickly people could misunderstand her. She replayed the encounter with Officer Mitchell again and again, feeling a mix of frustration and sadness. Why had she been perceived as a threat? Was it because of her skin color? Was it because she used sign language? Or both? As Zoe walked into the kitchen, her mother Tanya was already seated at the table, a steaming mug of coffee in hand. Tanya's face, normally bright and welcoming, was clouded with concern. She had been at work when Zoe came home the previous evening, so this was the first chance they had to talk about what had happened. Zoe had texted her the night before, summarizing the event, but Tanya knew this conversation needed more than a quick message. "Morning, baby," Tanya greeted her, motioning for Zoe to sit down at the kitchen table. "We need to talk about what happened yesterday." Zoe nodded and sat down, her hands resting on the table, fingers fidgeting in her lap. Tanya reached across and gently placed her hand over Zoe's, a gesture of comfort. "Tell me exactly what happened," Tanya said, her tone firm but loving. Zoe explained, using her voice in the way she did when she wanted to be perfectly clear. Her voice was soft but deliberate, something she had worked on over the years. She described sitting on the bench, talking to Alex, and then Officer Mitchell's arrival. She talked about how he had written out his questions, and the way he explained the judge's suspicion that her sign language might be gang signs. Tanya listened intently, her jaw tightening with each detail. When Zoe finished, her mother sat in silence for a moment, clearly trying to contain her emotions. As a black woman who had lived through her own share of prejudices and biases, Tanya wasn't shocked, but she was deeply angry that someone would mistake her brilliant, kind daughter for a criminal based solely on her appearance, and the way she communicated cut her to the core. After a long pause, Tanya finally spoke. "Zoe, I'm so sorry you had to go through that. No one, especially not a 14-year-old girl, should be treated like that. But we need to talk about what we're going to do next. This can't just be forgotten." Zoe looked up at her mother, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. "Do you really think it matters, Mom? I mean," the officer apologized. "It's over." Tanya shook her head, her voice firm. "No, baby, it's not over. What happened to you is part of a bigger problem, and staying quiet isn't going to change anything. People need to know what happened. The judge needs to know he was wrong." Zoe bit her lip, thinking about the judge. She didn't know him personally, but she knew his reputation. Everyone in Millbrook did. Judge William Hawthorne was like a fixture in the town, someone people saw as an untouchable authority figure. What could she possibly do to make someone like him see her differently? "But he's the judge," Zoe said quietly. "What can I do?" Tanya's eyes softened. "You can be yourself. You can show him, and everyone, who you really are. But this isn't just about you, Zoe. This is about the next person he judges too quickly. It's about standing up, even when it feels hard." As they continued to talk, Zoe began to realize that her mother was right. This wasn't just about one misunderstanding at the courthouse. It was about how people like her, people who didn't fit into society's narrow molds, were constantly being misjudged. And if she stayed silent, she would be allowing that to continue. Tanya hugged her daughter tightly before Zoe left for school, knowing that this conversation was just the beginning of something much bigger. Zoe wasn't just any child. She was bright, capable, and brave. She had been tested, and now they both knew there was a choice to be made about how to move forward. Meanwhile, in the polished, orderly chambers of the courthouse, Judge Hawthorne sat at his desk, unable to focus on his work. The events of the previous day lingered in his mind like an unwelcome shadow. He had called Officer Mitchell later in the evening to confirm again what had transpired, and though the officer had been professional and polite, the judge could sense an underlying message in his tone, a challenge to the authority the judge had always held without question. For the first time in a long time, Judge Hawthorne found himself questioning his judgment. He had prided himself on his ability to read people, on the instincts that had guided him for 3 decades on the bench. But had those instincts failed him this time? He leaned back in his chair, staring out the window at the same bench where Zoe had sat the previous afternoon. From his perspective, it had been so easy to assume the worst. He had seen her hands moving, had seen her skin, and his mind had filled in the rest. But now, in the quiet of his office, the realization that he might have been wrong gnawed at him. Not for the first time, he felt the heavy weight of his family's legacy pressing down on him. His father had been a well-respected judge, a man who never second-guessed himself, and his grandfather had been a lawyer known for his unshakable convictions. In this family, indecision was a sign of weakness, and Hawthorne had spent his life striving to live up to those high expectations. But the world was different now. There were voices, loud voices, calling for reform, for fairness, for empathy. And it seemed that the world was no longer willing to accept the simple black-and-white version of justice that Hawthorne had always believed in. He could feel the winds of change pressing in from all sides, and for the first time, he didn't know where he stood. As these thoughts swirled in his mind, his office door opened, and his clerk, Sarah, stepped in. She was a sharp, efficient young woman who had been working for him for the past 2 years. Though she was quiet, Hawthorne had come to respect her insights. Today, however, there was a different energy in the room. "Judge," she said hesitantly, "there's something I think you should see." He raised an eyebrow, motioning for her to continue. Sarah placed a printout of an article on his desk. The headline read, "Misjudged. Local teen harassed outside courthouse for using sign language." Beneath it was a photo of Zoe, smiling shyly in front of a group of students from her school. The article detailed the events of the previous day, highlighting the fact that Zoe had been mistaken for making gang signs simply because she was using sign language. As Judge Hawthorne read the article, a sinking feeling settled in his chest. The article didn't mention his name directly, but it was clear who had made the initial call to the police. The piece went on to talk about the broader issue of how people with disabilities and people of color were often misinterpreted, how society's biases played a role in shaping perceptions, and how those biases could lead to damaging consequences. Hawthorne's hands trembled slightly as he finished reading. His first reaction was defensiveness. How dare the media paint him as a villain for trying to protect his town? But as that anger simmered, it gave way to something else, something more uncomfortable. Guilt. Could he deny the truth in the article? He had judged Zoe without a second thought. He had jumped to conclusions based on her appearance and the way she communicated. And now, that snap judgment had become public knowledge. It wasn't just about his reputation. Something deeper was at stake. His sense of justice, his identity as a judge, was built on the belief that he was fair and impartial. But how could he be if he was so easily swayed by prejudice? He pushed the article away, rubbing his temples. This wasn't just about one girl or one article. It was about everything he had come to believe in, and whether those beliefs still held up in a world that was changing faster than he could keep up with. The weight of that realization pressed down on him. For the first time in years, Judge Hawthorne found himself at a crossroads, uncertain of the path ahead. Zoe's day at school had been long. Word of what happened at the courthouse had spread quickly, and while most of her classmates were supportive, There were whispers in the hallways, curious stares and questions she wasn't ready to answer. As she walked home, her mind was full of thoughts about her conversation with her mom, about the future, about whether she could make a difference. What would it mean to stand up for herself? What would it mean to challenge someone as powerful as Judge Hawthorne? By the time she reached her front door, she felt overwhelmed, but she also felt a flicker of something else, a determination growing within her. This wasn't just her story anymore. It was part of something bigger. And in her heart, Zoe knew that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. To be continued. In this part, we see the emotional ripple effects of the courthouse incident on both Zoe and Judge Hawthorne. While Zoe grapples with what it means to stand up for herself in the face of authority, Judge Hawthorne begins to confront the uncomfortable possibility that his biases have clouded his judgment, setting up the deeper conflict to come. Facing the truth. The days following the courthouse incident brought with them a whirlwind of emotions and unexpected consequences for both Zoe and Judge Hawthorne. In the small town of Millbrook, news traveled fast, and the story of the police call on a 14-year-old girl had taken on a life of its own. At Zoe's school, her teachers, friends, and even students who had never really talked to her before were suddenly aware of her in a way they hadn't been before. For the first time, Zoe felt like she was being seen, but it wasn't the kind of attention she had wanted. Zoe sat in the front row of her classroom, nervously tapping her pen against her notebook as her teacher went over the day's lesson. But her mind wasn't on the equations scribbled on the board. Instead, she was thinking about the article that had come out, the countless whispers, and her conversation with her mother. Despite the media attention, despite people reaching out to her, there was one voice she hadn't heard from. The judge. Judge Hawthorne, the man responsible for the misunderstanding, had been silent. No apology, no acknowledgement. And that weighed on her more than anything. After school that day, Zoe found herself sitting on the steps of the same courthouse where everything had begun. She stared up at the building, her sketchbook resting on her knees. The weathered stone structure seemed imposing, as if it represented everything in Millbrook that wouldn't change. The town had always been slow to progress, holding on to old traditions and ideas, and Zoe wondered if her story would make a dent in that wall of resistance. She pulled out her phone, instinctively opening her video call with Alex. Her best friend answered immediately, her face lighting up the screen. "Hey, how are you holding up?" Alex asked, her concern clear. Zoe shrugged, signing and speaking at the same time. "It's a lot. People keep asking me questions. Teachers, students, even strangers online." Alex nodded. "Yeah, I saw the article. You're famous now. But I know that's not what you wanted." Zoe let out a deep sigh, a mix of frustration and exhaustion. "It's like no one cares about who I really am. They just care about the story." "I care." Alex signed, her hands moving quickly. "And so does your mom. We care about you." Zoe smiled weakly. "Thanks. I don't know what to do next. Mom wants me to make a big deal about this, but I don't know if I'm ready. Judge Hawthorne hasn't even said anything. What if he doesn't care?" Alex frowned. "You don't have to wait for him, Zoe. You have a voice, and people are listening now. Don't let his silence make you think what happened doesn't matter." Zoe nodded, but the uncertainty still gnawed at her. What did standing up for herself really look like? And could she really challenge someone as powerful as a judge? Meanwhile, across town, Judge Hawthorne sat in his office, staring at the same article that Zoe had read. It was now printed out on his desk, the pages slightly crinkled from where his hands had clenched them earlier. The headline screamed at him, "Misjudged. Local teen harassed outside courthouse for using sign language." The words played over in his mind, a harsh reminder of the mistake he had made. He had called the police on a 14-year-old girl because he had misunderstood her. He had assumed the worst because of a combination of her race and the unfamiliar way she communicated. And now, the whole town knew. The whole town was watching him, waiting to see what he would do next. But what could he do? His pride, a pride shaped by decades of service, by the weight of his family's legacy, was at war with the nagging voice in the back of his mind that told him he had been wrong. Admitting that would be admitting weakness, admitting that his instincts, honed over 30 years on the bench, were flawed. His clerk, Sarah, knocked lightly on his door before entering. She had been hesitant around him since the article had come out, but her professionalism remained intact. "Judge Hawthorne," she said quietly, "there's been another call from the media. They want a statement from you about the courthouse incident." The judge looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "Tell them I have no comment at this time." Sarah hesitated, then nodded. As she turned to leave, she paused, her back to him. "Sir, if I may speak freely." Hawthorne raised an eyebrow. He wasn't used to his staff speaking out of turn, but he respected Sarah's intelligence enough to listen. "Go ahead." Sarah turned back to face him, her hands clasped in front of her. "I think an apology would go a long way. People are upset, and not just because of the mistake. They're upset because they don't feel like you see them, like you're out of touch with the reality they live in." The judge's jaw tightened. "I've always done what's best for this town. I've kept order. I've upheld the law." "Yes, sir. But sometimes the law can't see everything," Sarah replied softly. "Sometimes it's about more than just the law. It's about understanding." Judge Hawthorne didn't respond immediately. He knew Sarah had a point, but admitting it felt like betrayal to his principles, to his father and grandfather, and to the image he had built over the years. Still, her words stuck with him long after she left the room. Later that evening, as Zoe sat at the dinner table with her family, the doorbell rang. Her father, Marcus, stood to answer it, his large frame moving slowly after a long day at the auto shop. When he opened the door, Zoe heard a voice she didn't expect, a deep, authoritative voice she had only heard in courtroom recordings. "Mr. Johnson, my name is Judge William Hawthorne." Zoe froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. Her parents exchanged a look before Marcus turned back to the door. "What brings you here, Judge?" I'd like to speak with your daughter, if that's all right," Judge Hawthorne said, his tone uncharacteristically hesitant. Tanya stood from the table, motioning for Zoe to stay seated. "Why? What do you want to say to her?" The judge hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "I came to apologize for what happened at the courthouse. I made a mistake, and I need her to hear that from me." Zoe's heart pounded in her chest. This was the moment she hadn't expected, the moment she wasn't sure she was ready for. But as she looked at her mother, who gave her a nod of encouragement, Zoe knew she couldn't stay silent. Slowly, she rose from her seat and walked toward the door, her hands shaking slightly. As she stood in front of the judge, she realized just how tall he was, how imposing his presence felt. But she also realized something else. He looked vulnerable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Judge Hawthorne broke the silence. "Zoe, I'm sorry," he said, his voice low but sincere. "I let my assumptions cloud my judgment. I saw you, and I didn't see you for who you really are. I only saw what I wanted to see. And that was wrong." Zoe stared at him, her emotions swirling inside her. Part of her wanted to be angry, to demand more from him, to make him feel the weight of what he had done. But another part of her, the part that her mother had nurtured, the part that believed in forgiveness, knew that this apology, as imperfect as it was, mattered. "I appreciate the apology," Zoe said quietly, her voice steady. "But it's not just about me. It's about how you see people like me. You have a lot of power, and with that power comes responsibility. You can't just assume things." The judge nodded, his face serious. "You're right. I need to do better, and I will." They stood there for a moment, the tension between them slowly easing. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. And for Zoe, it was enough for now. As Judge Hawthorne turned to leave, Zoe's mother stepped forward, her eyes narrowing slightly. We'll be holding you to that, Judge. Hawthorne glanced back, meeting Tanya's gaze. I wouldn't expect anything less. The next day, Zoe returned to school with a new sense of purpose. The apology from Judge Hawthorne had been just the first step. Now, it was time to decide what came next. She wasn't sure what that would look like, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to let this moment pass without making sure it meant something. And in the quiet of his chambers, Judge Hawthorne sat alone, grappling with the changes taking root inside him. He had been wrong, and admitting that had shaken him to his core. But maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new, a chance to see the world with clearer eyes. To be continued. In this part, Zoe begins to grapple with the impact of the incident on her sense of self and her community. Judge Hawthorne, meanwhile, starts to confront his own biases and the role they play in his decisions. This moment of personal reckoning sets the stage for deeper transformation in both characters. A new understanding. In the days that followed their encounter, the reverberations of Judge Hawthorne's apology continued to echo through both Zoe's life and the community of Millbrook. For Zoe, the moment felt like a turning point, not just for herself, but for the potential to spark a larger conversation about acceptance, understanding, and social change. Inspired by the support from her family and friends, she decided to take her voice beyond the confines of the courthouse steps. Zoe convened a small meeting with her closest allies, Alex and a few other friends who had rallied around her. They gathered at her house one afternoon, spreading out in her living room, surrounded by sketches and posters from school projects. Zoe's mother, Tanya, brought in snacks, her warmth wrapping around the group like a comforting blanket. "All right, everyone, I want to talk about what we can do next," Zoe said, her voice steady as she set her phone to record their discussion. "This incident can't just be something that fades away. We need to turn it into something positive." Alex nodded vigorously. "Absolutely. People are paying attention right now. We should use that." One of the other girls, Maya, chimed in. "We could organize an event at school to raise awareness about sign language and how to communicate with people who have hearing impairments." "That's a great idea," Zoe replied, her eyes lighting up. "But it needs to be bigger than just our school. This should involve the whole community. If we can educate people about our differences and how to embrace them, maybe we can help change perceptions. What if we set up a workshop? We could invite people from the community to learn basic sign language," suggested Alex. "It would be a fun way to break down barriers and make new connections." Zoe smiled, feeling a surge of excitement. "Yes, and we could have speakers too. People who have experienced misunderstandings like this. Maybe we could invite Judge Hawthorne to speak, not just about the incident, but about what it means to listen and learn." The idea was met with mixed reactions. Some in the group hesitated at the thought of involving the judge who had made a mistake, but Zoe was firm. "If he's serious about wanting to change, then we have to give him a chance. This is about growth, not punishment." After hours of brainstorming, the group left Zoe's house filled with determination. They created a plan for an event titled Voices Unheard, Bridging the Gap, aimed at fostering communication and understanding within their community. Over the following weeks, they worked tirelessly, gathering resources, reaching out to community leaders, and organizing logistics. Zoe felt a renewed sense of purpose, each day more invigorating than the last. Yet, beneath the excitement, a small part of her remained anxious. Would the community be receptive? Would Judge Hawthorne agree to participate? Across town, Judge Hawthorne found himself grappling with his own set of challenges. Since his meeting with Zoe, he had made a conscious effort to reflect on his actions and the ingrained biases that had guided his judgment for so long. Sitting at his desk, he stared at the photographs lining the walls, snapshots of his family, of his predecessors in the legal field, wondering how he could live up to the legacy while adapting to a world that was changing faster than he was. One evening, after a long day at the courthouse, he decided to take a walk through the park, hoping to clear his mind. As he strolled, he noticed groups of children playing, families picnicking, and couples walking hand in hand. The laughter and joy surrounding him contrasted sharply with the weight on his shoulders. He approached a nearby bench, sitting down to observe. As he did, he spotted a group of teenagers nearby, their faces animated as they signed to one another. Judge Hawthorne watched, curiosity mingling with discomfort. These were the same gestures he had misinterpreted weeks ago, movements he had deemed suspicious. But now, in the light of the evening sun, they appeared vibrant and full of life. Suddenly, he felt an impulse to learn. He reached for his phone and Googled resources about sign language. In that moment, he realized the world wasn't just changing around him. He needed to change with it. He could no longer allow his biases to dictate his understanding. As Zoe and her friends put the final touches on their event, the buzz around Voices Unheard began to grow. Flyers were distributed throughout the schools and local businesses, and social media campaigns drew attention from the wider community. Encouraging responses flooded in. Even the local news station caught wind of the event and planned to cover it. The day of the event arrived, and Zoe felt a mix of excitement and nervousness as she set up in the school auditorium. Colorful posters decorated the walls, and a stage was set for speakers. Zoe took a deep breath, glancing at the audience as it began to fill. People from all walks of life were arriving. Families, community leaders, teachers, and even some of Zoe's classmates who had once bullied her. As the event commenced, Zoe stood at the podium, her hands shaking slightly. Welcome, everyone, to Voices Unheard, Bridging the Gap. Today, we're here to celebrate our differences, to learn, and to open our hearts to one another. The crowd applauded, and Zoe felt her nerves begin to settle. She introduced the first speaker, a local advocate for disability rights, who spoke passionately about the importance of understanding different forms of communication and embracing inclusivity. The audience listened intently, captivated by stories of resilience and the transformative power of acceptance. Next, Zoe introduced a panel of individuals who had experienced similar misunderstandings as she had. They shared their stories, each tale revealing the impact of assumptions and the vital need for open dialogue. The room was filled with a palpable energy as people leaned forward, eager to absorb the lessons being shared. Finally, the moment Zoe had both anticipated and dreaded arrived. She turned to the crowd, signaling to Judge Hawthorne, who had agreed to participate. He stood up, the expression on his face one of determination and humility. "Thank you for having me here today," he began, his voice steady but carrying the weight of his previous mistakes. "I'm here not only as a judge, but as a man who has learned a hard lesson. I want to extend my deepest apologies to Zoe and anyone else I may have harmed with my assumptions." Zoe watched intently as the judge spoke, the sincerity in his voice resonating with the audience. "This experience has opened my eyes to the biases I held, biases that stemmed from years of conditioning and tradition. But today, I stand before you all, willing to listen, learn, and do better." The room erupted in applause, and Zoe felt a swell of hope. This was the moment she had wished for. The chance to foster understanding and growth, not just for herself, but for everyone in Millbrook. As the day wore on, Zoe and her friends led interactive workshops, teaching attendees basic sign language and encouraging them to engage in conversations about inclusion and understanding. Judge Hawthorne participated actively, asking questions and connecting with attendees, showcasing a genuine desire to learn. By the end of the event, Zoe felt a sense of fulfillment wash over her. The community had come together in a way she had never imagined, bridging gaps and fostering connections. People who had previously avoided conversations about differences were now discussing how to make Millbrook a more inclusive place. As the last guests departed, Zoe gathered with her friends, a sense of pride bubbling within her. "We did it," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "We really made a difference today." Alex grinned, her enthusiasm infectious. "And we're just getting started. Imagine what we could do next." But as Zoe looked back at the empty auditorium, she also recognized the work that lay ahead. Change wasn't a one-time event. It was an ongoing journey, one that would require persistence, education, and an unwavering commitment to understanding. That night, Zoe lay in bed, reflecting on the day's events. The sounds of laughter and connection echoed in her mind, filling her heart with joy. She was tired but content, knowing they had sparked something in their community. Meanwhile, in his own quiet reflection, Judge Hawthorne stood on the porch of his home, looking up at the stars. The enormity of the day weighed heavily on him, but it also filled him with hope. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of excitement about what the future could hold, not just for him, but for the community he served. To be continued. In this part, Zoe and her friends take significant steps to foster understanding and change within their community. Judge Hawthorne confronts his biases and begins to embrace a new way of seeing the world, showcasing the potential for personal and communal transformation. The story builds toward a deeper sense of connection, growth, and the power of understanding, setting the stage for the final part. Seeds of change. In the weeks that followed the Voices Unheard, Bridging the Gap event, the community of Millbrook began to transform in ways that Zoe had only dreamed about. The event had ignited conversations that rippled through schools, businesses, and neighborhoods, leading to a deeper commitment to understanding and acceptance among its residents. Zoe found herself at the center of a movement. Encouraged by the response, she and her friends established a community group called Unity in Diversity. They began meeting regularly to plan initiatives, raise awareness, and foster connections within Millbrook. Their mission was simple yet powerful: to promote understanding among individuals of all backgrounds, abilities, and identities. One of their first initiatives was to collaborate with the local high school to create an after-school program for students interested in learning about various cultures, languages, and forms of communication. Zoe and her friends presented their proposal to the school board, and after a few tense moments of deliberation, it was unanimously approved. "This is just the beginning," Zoe declared to her friends, a bright smile lighting up her face. "We're going to show everyone that learning about our differences only makes us stronger." Meanwhile, Judge Hawthorne was also taking steps toward change. His experience at the Voices Unheard event had stirred something within him, a desire to actively engage with the community he had served for so long. He reached out to Zoe, eager to find ways to support her initiatives.